Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our tariff clarification aftermarket fuel cost recovery for our stakeholder group for miscellaneous meetings. My name is Brenda Marquez on behalf of the California ISO Stakeholder Affairs Group. We welcome you to this call. This call is being recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. Any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. This meeting is also structured to stimulate dialogue and engage different perspectives. So we also encourage comments to be professional and respectful for both our speakers and audience that are here today. As well, if you have any questions, we do encourage not repeating or refrain from repeating anything that has been said, but we could always answer those questions during this conversation, during the pause when our speakers are done. At this time, the raising a hand icon is also available for those who are joining us through the WebEx. You use the raise hand icon, look in the bottom of your screen. You'll be added to the queue. Make sure you say your full name and affiliation before stating a comment. And once you're done, please feel free to lower your hand if you don't have any follow-up questions to what you asked. Also, those who are dialed into the phone line, you may press *3. This only works if you're using it through the audio only line, so you will be able to be added to see and we'll be able to unmute you. As well, there's the chat questions also available, but we encourage verbal questions that will best help us and the speakers understand what you're asking. And also, our event producer is Ryan. He'll be here assisting us in today's call. For today's agenda, we'll have both David Zotlo and Sylvie Spiewak go over a few items that were posted, such as the white paper we just posted. I'll add that link to the chat in a moment, and also this presentation that will be added in the chat since we posted this morning. And then David will go through another walkthrough of the tariff clarification. So he'll be sharing the screens around slide 12. So everyone will see that showing on this presentation. And at this time, we'll go ahead and introduce David and Sylvie, and thank you so much.
Thanks, Brenda. I think we can go to the next slide and kick things off. My name is Sylvie Spiewak, Senior Policy Developer here at the ISO, and I'm joined by David Zotlo, who's from our counsel's office. And I'll kick us off by going over some of the policy background related to the tariff clarifications we'll be discussing today. So let's go to the next slide. The ISO is proposing some revisions to section 30.12 to ensure that the tariff reflects existing approved policy. So we won't be talking about changing any policy today. I'll just go over some of the policy background so that you understand what we're talking about when we dig into the tariff. So section 30.12 addresses the process for aftermarket cost recovery. And for reference, we'll also be going over the background that's included in sections 30.4 and 30.7 on reference levels and 30.11 on the reference level change request process. Since these tariff provisions came into effect in 2021, the ISO has identified several ambiguities with how the text of the tariff was meant to apply. And so the tariff clarifications we'll review today are really just intended to more closely align the tariff with the policy that already exists. Let's go to the next slide. So as background, reference levels and opportunities for cost adjustments are important to support efficient dispatch and cost recovery. So we've got standard resource-specific costs that are used to reflect reference levels, but they can't practically and always reflect actual costs perfectly. So the ISO provides scheduling coordinators with opportunities to request cost adjustments pre-market or ex ante when costs do or are expected to deviate from these calculations. Scheduling coordinators have two options that exist under the umbrella of the reference level change request process. And both of these options require that scheduling coordinators retain documentation to support these requests, but they are offered in different ways. The automated reference level change request process is an automatic process that will accept requested values within a range, otherwise known as the reasonableness threshold, and these are subject to after-the-fact audit. The other option is a manual review request, where the ISO reviews documentation ahead of time before the market runs, and if accepted, the ISO will recalculate all of the reference levels using the new approved cost value. And I think that's all you need to know before I pass it on to David. I'll pause for questions on this. Not hearing any.
You can go to the next slide. Okay. Well, good afternoon. This is David Zlotlo from the legal department, the ISO. So in terms of the tariff filing that we'll be presenting to FERC hopefully relatively soon, there's a couple goals that we had in pursuing this set of tariff clarifications. So those were laid out in the white paper, and we'll just do a quick refresher, a reminder of what those goals were, and then we'll get into tariff and just sort of walk through how the proposed revisions match up with those goals. So the first goal is, we see it on there, goal number 1. We have this, as Sylvia was explaining, the before market reference level change request process. The intent was that to be allowed to make the aftermarket requests for supplemental uplifts above and beyond bid cost recovery, the intent was that a resource must make a before market reference level change request as a necessary prerequisite to be eligible for the aftermarket uplift request. The logic of why those two go together is the idea that we want to get these things priced in the market as much as possible. So if a resource says, hey, my commitment costs are going to be really high because of some things that are happening in the gas market today, we give them the before market reference level change request process. It's there to give them the opportunity to explain why they need a temporary adjustment up in their biddable commitment costs. And so we want them to take advantage of that so that they can put that in their bids, can be reflected in the market, and the market has the opportunity to make an efficient decision. Because if the costs are super high for that resource, maybe costs are high for everyone, and maybe that's just what's going on. But you want to give the market the opportunity to optimize efficiently, economically. And so it was really important that the two things be paired. And so you see the first sort of bullet there, before market requirement supports least cost dispatch and market efficiency. And then I explained there, creates the incentive for scheduling coordinators to reflect their true costs. And also there's the strategic bidding element of, you wouldn't want to allow resources to submit artificially low commitment costs in the hopes that they get dispatched. And you want
Hey, Silly, we lost David from your end too?
I think we,
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And,
I can try and finish
But then
the
if
sentence.
that doesn't happen,
Oh, there he is.
you're protected by getting made whole through an aftermarket uplift request. Idea is we don't want to incentivize that kind of strategic activity. That's why it's important for the before market, aftermarket options to go together. So, we think that was relayed, reflected in the policy initiative underlying the current version of the tariff you see. However, there was, some, question raised in a FERC order recently, or not recently, probably about earlier this year, for an aftermarket request that went to FERC. There was some language in the FERC order suggesting those aren't always, they don't always go together. And so our goal here is to be clear in the tariff. Yes, they do. They do connected together. So we can go to the next slide, please. That's goal number 1. And I hope I am not lost here. Can you hear me? All right, my computer froze, but I think I'm still connected by phone. But if I'm not,
You are connected by phone.
okay, great. I was worried I had gotten lost. We can go to the next slide. Oh, there we go. I'm unfrozen. Yeah, perfect timing. Yeah, so we can go to the next slide, please. Oh, sorry.
Oh, let's go back one to goal number 2.
Yeah,
there we go.
Okay, great. Okay. Goal number 2, same standards apply regardless of who reviews the aftermarket uplift request. So there's an option, scheduling coordinators can either make the aftermarket request directly to the ISO, or they can make that request to FERC through a FERC filing. Or actually they can also make it to the ISO, and if the ISO doesn't approve it, then they can go to FERC afterwards. So it's kind of like there's 3 options. You can go to the ISO, you can go to FERC, or you can go to FERC after the ISO rejects or doesn't approve the aftermarket request. But the point was, the same standards, the same sort of documentation should apply. It shouldn't matter whether you're going to the ISO or FERC. The same standards, the same information requirements, the same outcome if the request is successful, it should all be the same. There should be no strategic benefit in which venue the aftermarket request is submitted. And the rationale here is that Section 30.12 provides a pretty streamlined process for cost recovery. If a market participant thinks that there's something extraordinary about the circumstances of a particular trading day, and they've, been unable to recover costs in some way that's, unjust and unreasonable, there's always, filing a 206 complaint. Not that I'm sitting here advising people to do that, but the point being is that there's other, other avenues to seek cost recovery besides Section 30.12. This isn't like Section 30.12 is the only way a market participant can ever seek sort of additional recovery. There's other procedural mechanism if it's important, right? But Section 30.12 is a pretty streamlined process relative to the other filing options that are available just generally sort of under FERC rules. And so the idea is, because it's sort of a special approach to outside the market recovery, there needs to be some rules around it, and we want to have the same rules apply whether it's going to FERC or going to the ISO. And again, if the request to FERC is outside of the streamlined rules and processes of Section 30.12, that's fine. Participants can always, look to avail themselves of all the rights that the Federal Power Act provides. But if we're just talking about Section 30.12, it's important to reiterate that it's the same standards, the same outcomes, everything is the same, regardless of who's reviewing the aftermarket request. So then we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, third goal, aftermarket uplift payments are limited to costs that could not be recovered from the market. So this is can be a subtle point, but it's important to spend a moment on it here. There's a distinction, I know I've sort of talked about, and maybe others have as well, the distinction between costs that were not recovered versus costs that were not recoverable. And the point we think of Section 30.12 is you were unable to recover costs through the market, not that you had unrecovered costs. And the distinction here is that we're giving this special opportunity under Section 30.12. The special opportunity is for cases where the market rules prevented you from having an opportunity to recover your costs. So it's not enough to say, hey, look, I failed to recover certain costs, I need to be made whole. That isn't the intent here. The intent here is to say there was something about the structure of the commitment cost process and the reference level change request. There was something structurally that prevented you from having an adequate opportunity to reflect your true costs in your bid. And when that happens, when you weren't able to adequately reflect those costs in a before market reference level change request, that's what Section 30.12 is about. So we need to reiterate, it's not enough to show, hey, I had unrecovered costs. Really the point is costs that could not be recovered, for example, because in the before market process, your request exceeded the reasonableness threshold, weren't able to approve it in time, or, for some reason, your request was rejected during a manual review of the before market process. At least you made an attempt to get those costs reflected in the market beforehand. If it didn't happen for some reason, fair enough, you're allowed to invoke Section 30.12. So let's go to the next slide, goal number 4, and then I think we can pause there if there's any questions. So final point here, Section 30.12, it's not meant to expand the scope of costs recoverable under bid cost recovery. So what that means is, and this goes to what does it mean to have a successful request, whether it's the ISO approves your request or FERC approves your request. You know, if you show up and say, hey, here's a list of the gas costs I incurred on that day, and let's say FERC says, yes, we agree you adequately demonstrated you incurred those costs, those prudently incurred, yes, approved. What does that mean? And the point is, to reiterate here, all that means is those costs get fed back through the bid cost recovery mechanism to determine what your, new incremental payment would be. So it's sort of what was the bid cost recovery you earned before? What is the bid cost recovery you would have earned you would have earned based on the fuel costs underlying that were approved. So you reprice the commitment costs. So it's sort of a before and after. The delta is the incremental payment that Section 30.12 is giving you. Point of saying this is that it's really just a rerunning of bid cost recovery. This isn't meant to allow other costs to be priced into the incremental uplift payment. And the white paper gives one example of costs that conceivably some parties could think would be included, and they're not. So it's like the opportunity cost of procuring gas on this date versus that day, and I sold it off to someone else, but I sold it on loss. But if I had known, I could have sold it earlier. Things like that. Those may be, sort of in economic sense, those may be losses that you incurred, but that's not the losses that Section 30.12 is meant to cover. It's strictly about repricing bid cost recovery based on demonstrated fuel costs and rerunning those through the commitment costs and then redoing bid cost recovery. So those are the four high-level goals we're trying to get to in this process. So I'll pause here if there's any questions. And while we're seeing if there's any questions, I'll then try to queue up the tariff language, and we will walk through the language itself. So pause here if there's any questions. And if not,
yeah, if there's go ahead, Ryan, give David presentation rates. If there's any questions, you can use the raise hand icon located above the chat participant window. But I don't see any at this time. And we're seeing your screens in a minute. It's still loading, David, so I'll let you know. Now we can see the Word document.
I'm just sort of resizing it to sit on my screen. Is it still showing up readable for everyone? Just want to make sure when I'm sharing that it's actually sharing in a way that people can read it.
Yes.
Okay.
Looks good to me.
Well, someone ping me if I need to make the text bigger or something like that. But otherwise, I'll just sort of run through the top. It's only, let's see, 4 pages here, so shouldn't be too long here. Okay, and I'll just start from the beginning and explain sort of what the changes are. So Section 30.12 is the high-level section dealing with the aftermarket recovery. So that's 30.12. Then you go to Section 30.12.1. What is the aftermarket recovery process apply to? Applicability. So the edits in 30.12.1 are supporting goal number 1, which is to say before market reference level changes requests are prerequisite. These clarifications or edits you're seeing here, this is meant to reinforce that the amounts in a reference level change request. So here, I'll just start reading. Scheduling coordinators may request an additional uplift payment for amounts in a reference level change request presented to the CAISO that the CAISO did not approve. So the point being, you have to present it to the CAISO, and the CAISO had to have not approved it. And if that holds, then you're eligible to make an aftermarket request. And then just as a reminder, you see Part A, which is about the topic we're talking about. Section 30.12 also covers item B about default energy bids, default minimum load bids that exceed the hard energy bid cap. That's part of Section 30.12 as well. That's not at issue in this call today, but just in case you're looking at that and you're sort of confused or not clear why that Part B is there, that is part of the issuing tariff. It's just not relevant to the call today. And then so you see in the bottom here, just reiterating, adding this point 2, current language says you can't request uplift payments associated with imbalance penalties. And then just to reinforce the point again, you can't request payments for costs that were not included in the reference level change request upfront. So that's 30.12.1. 30.12.2, you see some edits here. This is just in the area of the general clarification. It's not really driven by what I was talking about before. Here it's saying that there's certain timing requirements, 30 business days after the trading day. Just adding a sentence here, kind of clarifying what happens if you don't meet that 30 business day deadline. I think it was implied before that if there's a deadline, there's a consequence, and what would the consequence be? It sort of stands to reason the consequence is you're ineligible, but just adding that there is a more explicit statement. So not related to the 4 goals, just a more general clarification. Okay, then 30.12.3. This is, you see for requests under 30.12.4 and 30.12.5. So 30.12.4, as we'll see in a minute, that covers requests to CAISO. 30.12.5 covers requests to FERC, reinforcing and being more clear that the supporting documentation is the same regardless of where the request is sent. And that supports goal number 2, clarifying that it doesn't matter if you go to the CAISO or FERC for the aftermarket request. The substantive inquiry is the same, the supporting documentation. So that's what 30.12.3 is saying. The supporting documentation is the same regardless of where you're going. Then to 30.12.4, as I just said again, I said a moment ago, high level 30.12.4 is the heading for the CAISO requests directed to the CAISO, and then the subparts of 30.12.4 are specific to requests made to the CAISO. So 30.12.4.1, again, this is just a general clarification, a cross-reference to 30.12.3, which was the documentation, just to sort of reinforce the idea that we evaluate the costs based on the documentation presented. I saw that as more of a clarification, not related to the 4 goals that we were talking about before. 30.12.4.2, existing language, didn't see any clarifications called for in that section. So then moving on to 30.12.4.3, this whole provision is being deleted, and the reason why is that existing language is covering a statement of if you make a request to the CAISO, it's saying settlement of recoverable amount. But what we said is the goal is to reiterate the idea that whether you go to the CAISO or you go to FERC for the recovery, it's the same procedures, and most importantly, it's the same outcome. If we approve a request, whether it's the ISO or FERC approves the request, the outcome should be the same. So having a separate statement about how costs are recovered if the request is granted, having that statement under the CAISO section doesn't really make sense because we want to reinforce the idea that the outcome is the same regardless. So we'll get to that in a minute where we have new section 30.12.6, just having a more general statement of what it means to have a successful request. And that applies regardless of where the request is directed. Okay, then 30.12.4.4 and 30.12.4.5. Again, I was putting these in the category of general clarifications. Existing language says, like I said before, there's sort of 3 routes. You can go to the CAISO, you can go to FERC, or you can go to FERC after the CAISO rejects your request. In 30.12.4.4 and 30.12.4.5 cover the scenario of going to FERC after the CAISO either is unable to verify the cost. And 30.12.4.4 is covering the scenario where we get the request and we look at it and we say, we have 60 business days. We look at it, we can't make a determination because there's something that's unclear to us, or it's too complicated or whatever. For whatever reason, then you have the ability as a scheduling coordinator to go to FERC. And then separately, 30.12.4.5 says, if we make a determination, we say, no, this is rejected, you're ineligible. Well, we're not the final word on that. If you say, no, I think I'm still eligible, I'm going to go to FERC, that's fine. And then that's what 30.12.4.5 is saying. So that's existing language. Just these changes are to try to just be more clear and direct about the sort of the procedures, the order of operations, et cetera. But we did not view that as making any changes in line with the 4 goals we were talking about. Okay, so moving on then, section 30.12.5, sorry, there we go. High level, that's dealing with FERC requests. So there's currently 2 subsections to that, 30.12.5.1, 30.12.5.2. So 30.12.5.1, it's supporting goal number 2, which is about same standards apply, and it's also some general clarification. So it's saying, you know, first of all, reiterating the idea of first sentence here, the evaluation that FERC makes is based on the documentation specified in 30.12.3, reinforcing the idea that it's the same documentation that goes to FERC as it goes to ISO, so the basis of review is the same. And then it's saying here, reiterating, you have to meet the timing deadlines, whether it's the 90 business days for a direct request to FERC, or if you go to the FERC after the CAISO either rejects or is unable to validate, then it's also giving a statement of how long you have to file at FERC. And then sort of reinforcing the concept of what happens if you don't meet the deadline again. Felt it was implicit before, but adding a more direct statement saying failure to meet the 90 business day deadline means you're out of luck for making an aftermarket request. So it's 90 days to go to FERC, whether it's an initial request or it's after the ISO has not approved the request you put to them for aftermarket. So that's 30.12.5.1, and then 30.12.5.2 is being deleted. The reason why, same as what I said before for the CAISO-specific provision, this covered what does the ISO do if the request is granted, and that is really consolidated in new section 30.12.6, which is meeting goals number 3 and 4. So here, 30.12.6 is meant to create a single unified statement outlining what it means if you get your aftermarket request granted. So it's 2 things really. We make basically a straight resettlement of the bid cost recovery that you would have gotten had you been able to bid your commitment costs up to the cap based on the validated fuel costs. But there's an important part at the end here that I'll note. To reinforce the idea that you have to have given the market every opportunity to price in your true commitment costs, the incremental payment can't exceed the difference between the highest bid cost recovery you could have gotten had you bid to the maximum allowable amount. And so what that means is, and I mentioned it a little bit before in talking about the goals, let's say you make a before market reference level change request, and you're able to bid up your commitment cost up to a certain level, but you don't actually bid up to that level. You still bid low commitment costs, even though you have the capability to bid much higher. Well, in that case, you haven't given the market every opportunity to price in your true fuel costs. And that's, we want to reinforce the idea that this special aftermarket recovery is when costs were unrecoverable, when there was no way to have recovered them from the market. So that last sentence I'm highlighting here is making the point that we're going to limit the recovery to the delta between BCR at the approved fuel costs and the BCR you would have earned if you had bid to the highest commitment cost level available to you approved before market. And so if you bid low, we talked about there's a potential approach where you could bid low commitment costs to be committed, and then if there's a price spike, you profit. If you don't, then you're still protected by getting cost recovery. That's not something we want to allow, and so this is really making clear that your recovery is only going to be for what you would have gotten had you initially bid up to the highest commitment cost level allowable. So it's just sort of a protection there. So that is the tariff amendments we have in mind here. I'll pause here if there's any questions on the details. And let me know if there's any raised hands.
I don't see any questions. Ryan, do you see any questions on your queue?
No, I do not.
Okay. Fair enough. Well, I will stop sharing the tariff document, and that covered the walkthrough of the tariff we're looking to file, and that's a segue into next steps. So we can go to the next slide, please. Oh, did we skip a slide, or did we not have a? Well, if we didn't have an explicit next step slide, I'll just tell you what next steps are. So, we have these clarifications. I think we didn't say this explicitly yet, but, we view all of this as to make the tariff more consistent with the existing policy. So, there's no, board approval here we saw as necessary. There was, tariff language that we felt in one case, there was a FERC order that interpreted the existing tariff language in a way that we thought was inconsistent with the underlying policy, and there's other sort of clarifications, but this is all to make sure that there's no confusion about the tariff aligning with approved policy. So we're planning to just go ahead and file this at FERC. Probably not in December here. We're getting close to the holidays here, but in January, our intent would be probably in January to present this to FERC and hopefully get it approved. And, part of the concern or the impetus for getting this moving is the idea that the aftermarket recovery is really, it's, for the most part, not really important except when there's high gas market volatility. That's really what this whole process is about. Both before market and aftermarket is there as a sort of a safety valve in cases where there's gas market volatility, and that the regular process of setting, the default, the reference levels can't sort of sync up with how quick gas prices are changing. So if there's no gas market volatility, then these provisions are kind of like, they're not used, it doesn't really matter. But as we are getting into winter, that's when we see the higher risks of gas market volatility. And so we want to have these clarifications, in effect for coming into winter 2025, where obviously we're at the end of 2024, but, want to get it in place as soon as we can now that we've sort of identified them, thought it through. So with that, I do see a hand raised by Dan Williams, so we can take that question, please.
Sure, not a problem. All right, Dan, you're unmuted.
And Dan Williams from the Energy Authority. Can you flip back to that last tariff page that you were on? Sorry, it's just taking me a minute to get the thoughts together to do this. I think the red line, the last red line one. So what's kind of been unclear to me at this, going back to, I guess, February 2022, when some of these issues first came up, was how an entity is supposed to.
I was just waiting to get the presenter rights to put the language back.
Oh,
yeah. So go ahead.
Yeah, just has ISO contemplated a scenario where an entity doesn't know that there's going to be sufficient volatility to need a after the fact recovery when they are submitting their initial commitment cost bids, and therefore may not have sort of bid the maximum commitment cost, but nevertheless, like the market moved the way that it moved, and they ended up having significantly higher fuel costs. I don't think ISO or DMM would want entities to be speculatively overbidding their commitment costs. Am I making any sense there? Have you thought about that aspect?
There's actually in the original policy that we did think about this, and this is why by default commitment costs and default energy bids include a multiplier, and that multiplier is intended to cover some incidental error that might occur due to volatility. And that multiplier is also included in the reasonableness threshold, and the language in the policy is pretty explicit that you're allowed to request a cost adjustment for expected costs that you think are going to incur due to volatility. Now, the BPMs are pretty clear around what sort of evidence you need to provide in order to submit these requests. And one of those is to retain documentation when those costs occur in order to fulfill the after the fact audit. But you do have that wiggle room, and the policy asks that you, in good faith, submit to the best of your knowledge what those costs are going to be.
But is there a scenario where an entity may feel like they are accurately submitting their commitment costs, inclusive of that headroom, but still doesn't get to the maximum amount, but then does exceed it because of the fuel cost change between day ahead and real time? It's just sort of that qualifier. It just strikes me as odd that you have to sort of be able to predict that there's going to be sufficient volatility to reflect that in your initial bid in order to get after the fact recovery, because it's kind of asking you to be somewhat able to predict the future, but not fully.
Well, I think part of what I recall is part of the concern was that there's lags, that the default reference levels are based on fuel index prices, and that there's a time lag. So there's cases, I don't remember where it's like it's being priced based on fuel prices that are like 2 days out of date, for 3 days, I guess. I don't remember the details, but I think, I think the idea was by the time the day ahead bidding is happening, you kind of can see what's happening for gas the next day. And I thought that the question of volatility that happens sort of within the day ahead time frame was a different question. I thought we had Sylvia, help me out. Isn't there a different initiative that's looking at some of those gas price sort of issues?
Yeah, I would also encourage you to check out the business practice manuals on this, because there are scenarios that it describes where it says things like, if you don't have precise cost information by the time you need to or want to submit your cost adjustment request, you can submit the request for what you think it is, and then you're expected to make a good faith effort to readjust once that information becomes more clarified. But that's all, the specifics of that we have thought through and are listed in the BPMs, and it explains the types of documentation that you might want to provide. One of the examples it gives is a failed attempt to procure gas at the nominally indexed prices. And obviously that's not a price quantity pair that tells you the accurate cost that it's going to be, and we understand that might happen. So that's an example of what you might know in order to base your cost request on, and then we expect you to go back and revise it and retain more information if possible.
Okay. Well, that's reassuring then that they've kind of thought through those scenarios and feel like there's kind of adequate workarounds. I understand the intent of what's there to remove kind of that commitment gaming opportunity. Just want to make sure there wasn't kind of another form of harm that could show up. So thanks for taking the time to walk through that. and for the effort overall. I think these clarifications are helpful.
Okay, great. Well, I'll leave the Word doc up for a second in case there's any other questions on the tariff language, just for a second I'll just go back to explain again next steps. You know, as I said, we're hoping to get the tariff filing presented to FERC relatively soon. As I said, we're sort of mid-December already. Probably not before the end of the year, but early next year, I think, is when you would expect to see it submitted, and then hopefully it goes smoothly. And if there is any more sort of extreme weather events, like really happened right as we were implementing these current provisions in 2021, we'll have this additional clarity. So, the market participant community has more clarity. They can look at the tariff and be more clear about exactly what's expected of them if they have the need for these aftermarket or before market requests. Well, I don't see any more questions, so I will stop sharing again and covered next steps. So I think I could turn it over to Brenda at this point.
Thank you, David and Sylvie. So at this point, next steps are already discussed by David. We do have the opportunity, if you have any questions, just ISO stakeholder affairs at kaiso.com. The white paper and the presentation is posted under that miscellaneous page, so you'll be able to see that. I also sent it over through chat. But at this time, I don't see any further questions for the team. I think we'll just give it a second and then we'll close this call. But thanks so much, everyone. All right. Seeing none, let's go ahead and pass it to Ryan to close this call. Thank you.
All right, that concludes our conference. Thank you for using Teller Event Services. You may now disconnect.